Hello, Professor Thibault. Thank you for taking this interview. So we have 5 questions for you. First, we wonder for you, what is languaging? Also, why and how is it different from the normal term of language?
Okay, that of course needs a bit of unpacking into a number of different components. Um, I use the term languaging, and I'm by no means the only person using that term, to get at the idea that it's something we do, and we do it in time as action, as activity. Okay, whereas as commonly thought of, language, on the other hand, is something that we use as if it were something already given, pre-existing. And my particular use of the term derives from the Chilean biologists of cognition, Maturana and Varela. For example, in their 1987 book, Theory of Knowledge, they have a whole chapter called languaging. Okay, now while they have differences from them, and I don't need to go into their theory now, but one of the important things that they, after all, they're biologists, is the naturalistic grounding of languaging, okay, in the human body and brain and so on. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we reduce it to that. So in my conception, languaging encompasses the two domains in which we exist: our biology, our embodied being in the world, and the fact that we are cultural beings. We inhabit what I call the human ecology. Actually, the human ecology idea brings together culture and nature in a more encompassing view. So languaging is part of what it means for us to operate as human beings and become human beings in the world. And you could say, to use an analogy, it's more verb-like than noun-like. So whereas nouns typically connote things, okay, verbs connote process, action, and so on. So that's how I prefer to see it, as something dynamic. We do it, okay. Typically we do it with other people, though not always, and that happens in this human ecology. And we're trying to make things happen as human agents, where we're trying to change. We're involved in flows of activities, okay, with other people, and we try to, through our languaging and other forms of action with which languaging is integrated, we try to bring about changes, get someone to do something, draw someone's attention to something. In other words, modify their awareness, okay, point to something that's interesting, and so on. While we were waiting for this recording to start, our camera operators here were busy talking about, and they were moving the cameras around. They were talking about where they were going to be positioned and so on. So the languaging that they were engaging in was tied up with something relevant to the current activity and the objects, the equipment that they had to position and set up and so on. So you see, languaging is typically integrated with other forms of human activity. Okay, this is a point that Roy Harris, in his work, has often made, but it's one that I very much take on board in this conception of languaging. So all those ideas, there's much more I could say, but the basic idea is process in time, and the temporal dimension is something that's really fundamental, okay, and it's often neglected in more conventional views of language as an object. The other point I'd make here is the distinction that's been in my work for quite a while now between what I call the first order languaging on the one hand, and second order language. Now, people in linguistics for the most part, and also just in the let's say the folk theories, what they're everyday thinking about language, think of it as words and other kinds of verbal abstracta like sentences and so on, the kinds of things that we see in the grammar books. Okay, for me they all come from the second order. They're abstract entities that we've constructed in the second order, whereas the first order is what we're doing now, or what the camera operators were doing before. Okay, so embodied engagement with things, affordances, objects, tools, technologies, and so on, in the world, okay, but at the same time we draw on these patterns that originate from these cultural historical timescales that didn't originate in the here and now, unlike the first order. Okay, so we draw on and we adaptively modify them, okay, to suit present circumstances. So that it's a meshing there of the first and the second orders in what we're doing. Okay, when I talk now, I draw on patterns, grammatical patterns of wordings and so on, certain genre conventions and so on, which I didn't create, okay, which are part of this, let's say, community heritage, if you like, the traditions of a community that I draw on to do what we're doing now. But that meshes with what we're doing now and helps to scaffold it, to guide it, to give it shape and direction and so on. So there's always there's no languaging without the verbal. So, okay, that's really important to establish. So it's not just bodies in movement, it's languaging bodies. Okay, basically engaging with aspects of the human world.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Thibault. So next question, we wonder, what does languaging enable people to do?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. In many ways, that one could spend a long time on all of these questions. One thing I'd say, it enables us as humans to solve what the philosopher Lewis, in a 1969 book called Convention, he talked about the coordination problem. Okay, so I think human languaging is one, but by no means the only culturally evolved solution we've devised to this coordination problem. We have to coordinate across time, across place, with other people, with other aspects of the human ecology, for example, technologies, tools, artifacts, and institutions and so on. Okay, so it's a means of coordination. It's a means of focusing and differentiating aspects of the environment which enable us to selectively focus on what's relevant or important in the course of interacting with that environment, and that, of course, the environment includes centrally other people, but not only. Okay, so we differentiate or partition, as they say in AI, the environment, and aspects of the grammatical construction of utterances enable us to do that. Mm-hmm. We, of course, enact values. Okay, so where values realizing through our languaging and other forms of action. Okay, there's some of the things we do. So essentially, I see it as if you think of pointing in the very basic sense, if you ask me where's the bus station, and then I point to where the bus station is, okay, some of the fundamentals of languaging build on this very elementary action of pointing to indicate something in the world. That's okay. So, but of course, languaging does it in a much more complex way, and so the certain aspects of the grammar help us to differentiate. So if I say, "Oh, the bus station's over there," or "the Robert Black Hall is across the street out there," okay, and I can point, and so languaging enables us to provide indications of things and differentiate the things in the environment which have potential for further interaction, which have relevance for further action in relation to them. So there's some of the things we do with language,
yeah.
I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. So next question, we wonder, how does languaging relate to the people who language and also to the world?
Okay, yeah. I tend more and more to think of, or rather I'm trying to think of, I mean, people in the 20th century talked about the linguistic turn, which changed a lot of things in people like Wittgenstein and philosophy, so philosophy of language and linguistics and semiotics more generally. There's a turn to the centrality of language in human life, but something got left out in my view of that picture. The world receded. Okay, and so my thinking about languaging and embedding it in this idea I have of the human ecology seeks to re-establish the centrality of the fact that through languaging, it's not a thing in itself. It's a way of managing what we're doing with other people and with those other aspects of the human ecology. So managing our relationship to that. So I want to put those things back together. So in the terms I use, I'll try and unpack this a little bit. Languaging is a way, amongst other forms of action, it's not exclusive in this, but it has its own specific characteristics. Languaging is a way of co-articulating or helping us to create, in relation to particular situations, particular tasks and so on that we're engaged in, functional fits between ourselves and aspects of the task, or in relation to other people and so on. And that also ties in the idea of coordination that we touched on earlier. So creating functional fits where someone is adapting their bodily and brain through their languaging to the requirements of the task in order to get things done. So, and of course a lot of learning is about that, how we acquire those capacities and continue to improve them and develop them. And languaging plays a big, not exclusive role in doing that for us human beings. Okay, so it's putting back then the centrality of the world in relation to people. Okay, and what people do as embodied beings, we have a certain type of embodiment. And I think that if you reduce language to second order abstracta, you're going to miss all the crucial embodiment. But that doesn't mean, on the other hand, we need to be careful. It doesn't mean that languaging is just bodily activity. That's a part of it. So you wouldn't want to downwardly, so to speak, reduce it to the body, because we also transcend our bodies. We are through the verbal and its semantic dimensions of languaging, we can move in these virtual realms beyond the here and now. Okay, which to use a term from this Swedish linguist Per Linnell, we are situation transcending. Okay, as well as being grounded in situations. So languaging does both. We're grounded in situations, deictically speaking. At the same time, we can transcend and move beyond the here and now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So next question, let's move on to grammar. So, linguists and language educators, they usually focus a lot on grammar. So we wonder if there's any place for grammar in your view of languaging, and how would you explain grammar?
Okay, first of all, it's absolutely central. I mean, there's no languaging in the sense that I define it without a central place for lexicogrammar. So I use the term that Michael Halliday, to lexicogrammar rather than just grammar. It's a continuum. Actually, that's in Saussure too. That understanding quite clearly so as well. So, but if you have a code view of language, okay, where you see the grammar as a means of coding ideas, whatever you want to call them, ideas, thoughts, contents, information for the purpose of transmission from one person to another. The classic talking heads model that you see reproduced right back to Saussure's speech circuit idea in the course in general linguistics, but through many textbooks ever since. Okay, I don't think that's a viable model of how this works for a number of reasons. We might be able to go into those, but I think because I see it as an action system. Okay, now the point here is that the grammar is a set of constraints and enablements on what we're doing. Okay, so the grammar, and here I would distinguish constraints from causes. I'm an agent, you're an agent, or we are potentially, not always agents, but potentially we can make things happen. We do things and make other things happen. And so to speak, we construct productive causal series. Like if I ask you to hand me a glass of water, that would be a simple example. Okay, we form a kind of, I recruit you to my project. We form a kind of co-actional, co-agency relationship in order to make that something happen in the world. I get my cup of or my glass of water. Okay, whereas constraints, on the other hand, are restrictions on what in dynamic systems thinking they talk about degrees of freedom. So constraints are limitations on the degrees of freedom of some system. If I say, give me that bottle that's on the table there, okay, so that utterance together with my little pointing action there directs your attention and focuses your attention, or at least that's what I try to do through that action, through that utterance, on that particular object sitting on the table beside us. And in doing that, it's not the verbal patterning in the utterance doesn't make it's inert on its own. It's just abstractor, an inert abstractor. Okay, but it focuses your attention and mine on a particular aspect of all the multitude of competing possibilities that we might focus on in this environment here, in this office here, or even outside, looking out the window and so on. So I focus your attention and mine, and therefore coordinate and direct our attention towards this bottle here, just for the sake of the argument. And so the verbal aspect of that, because I mentioned there's a lexical item bottle there, and this bottle, so I'm pointing to that particular bottle on the table. All those things function. We don't need to worry about the technicalities here, just the basic principle. You could go into the lexical semantics, the Dexis at work, all that. We don't. Just the basic principle. I constrain your attention to a particular thing. But it's me as an agent who makes, together with you, because that's co-agency, okay, that we get that, eventually I get my cup of water. Okay, so I make that kind of, so going back to the specific question, lexicogrammar helps us to constrain and guide and scaffold and direct the flow of the action, okay, and give it, and because it's a state, because if you think of what we're doing in the first order is constantly in flux, because that's a flow in time, and the lexicogrammar, which is deriving from the second order, helps to stabilize that. Okay, and of course, any given utterance that I might make, such as the one I made, always entails an addressee, someone who is the recipient, yourself in this case. So as people like Vygotsky, Voloshinov, Bakhtin all said in the 1920s and 30s, an utterance is, the meaning's not in the utterance, so the grammar helps to constrain it and provide indications to you as to how you have to activate the potentialities of that utterance with regard to, or if you like, in relationship to the particular aspect of the situation which the utterance helps to make relevant at that particular moment in the situation. Because after all, the situation itself is not static. It's something, it's in the flow, in other words. So we bring to bear in order to manage aspects of the flow by, through our languaging, therefore the utterances in relationship to particular aspects of the flow. So it's a stabilizing thing there. I mean, again, we could go in the Hallidayan view of, let's say there are constraints which are phonological and grammatical and so on, internal to language. Okay, and there are intrinsic functional constraints, and one could reformulate Halliday's metafunctions in those terms. Okay, yet the constraints intrinsic to language, or what some people might call language form, that's okay. They enter into functional synergies and therefore interact with other kinds of constraints, which are, for example, social, cognitive, and so on. Okay, situational and so on. Otherwise it wouldn't work. It's got to connect with the world. Okay, there have to be means whereby it can connect with the world. If you think of a code theory, okay, and the fundamental principle of a code, a true code, such as Morse code, what is it? 3 dots in code, S. I think that one's right. It doesn't matter anyway if I've got that wrong, but a code theory presumes that what is to be coded is already known in advance. Okay, whereas languaging doesn't work like that. Otherwise, everything would be known in advance, and we wouldn't be able to create any forms of new knowledge, and advance our epistemic relations with the world around us. But that's not how language works. So, in a code theory, which often relies on some idea of passive inputting from the outside, okay, and it's encoding, or on the other hand, pre-packaged ideas or thoughts inside someone's head, which are then recoded into linguistic form for the purpose of transmission to someone else, like you to me, for example, or me to you. Okay, when you see it as a form of action with its own, let's be clear, it's a form of human action that is languaging. At the same time, it has its very specific characteristics, okay, which some basic things in common with all action systems: goal-directedness, anticipatory dynamics, and other things, and error proneness. All actions can be in error, but it has fantastically complex dynamics because of these things we're calling grammar, and that which a simple action like reaching for a cup of water don't obviously have. At the same time, there are some basic things in common. Okay, so having said all that, whereas a code, I mean, think of it like this: the absurdity and the illogicality of encoding something like the bottle on the table there. In saying the bottle, the word doesn't encode that bottle on the table. What it does is it points from me to the bottle and sets up a coordination between you and me and the bottle. Yeah. Okay, basically. So and the lexical semantic potential of, say, the noun bottle, as distinct from the flowers here, directs your attention not to the flowers but to the bottle. So it activates in you, okay, an attentional focus. I mean, Gibson used the term in his ecological psychology. He used the term, which I think is an extraordinarily fertile idea, what he called education of attention. Again, he was concerned with perception, okay, and what languaging does, amongst other things, is modulate and educate, if you like, to use his term, attention. Okay, because what attention does is, and we're doing it all the time with each other, both in formal, like teaching, learning settings, and also in all aspects of human life. We have to coordinate attention. We have to, and therefore modify people's awareness of the environment around them in order to do things together. Okay, so but in the case of language, because it has this situation transcending dimension, because of the verbal and its semantics and that, we can lift ourselves out of the immediate here and now, and we not only move in the material environment, we also move around in these virtual worlds that we've created. And I don't mean the virtual worlds of virtual reality in the sense of digital technologies. What I mean is the virtualities that are created by language itself. Okay. And that's a big part of what it means to be human. Our ability to, and we do it all the time. I like to think in terms of a lot of languaging is rehearsal for things that we may do or may not do in the future. Like if I think about if we were earlier, we were discussing how we were going to do this interview. Now we're actually doing it. But when we were talking about it earlier, we were engaged in a kind of rehearsal. Okay, planning it, thinking about it, how it might go, and those sorts of things. And when the camera people arrived, they too were rehearsing. They were working out where best to place the cameras, should the curtains be open or closed. There were discussions going on about that. These are all rehearsals which may or may not be actualized. And when they're actualized, as Deleuze said, that it's not like realizing, it's not like what's in the virtual is then copied into the real. Okay, rather there are variant actualizations. So there's no one way of doing it, but, which will depend on circumstances and that. Okay, but so, and a huge part of human life is moving in this virtual realm that we've created, essentially, but not exclusively, through languaging. I mean, all action is pitched at the future, because this and that means all action, whether it's linguistic action, the simple act of reaching for the bottle, very simple action like that, is already predicated, if you like, on a possible future, which may or may not work out. I might fail to grasp the bottle. The bottle might fly off the table because of a big gust of wind, etc., etc. So the action might fail. But nonetheless, we understand it as an attempted action. It has its telos, even in failing, because it was aiming to do something which exists in the future. So even the simplest forms of action have this aspect to them. They're modal, even though when they're not marked chromatically as languages are, with modalities, like possibility and usuality, evidentiality, and those things that languages across the world have in different kinds of ways. But so there's a basic ungrammaticalized modality simply because it's moving into and seeking to actualize a potential future. So the idea of potentiality, which is a virtuality, means it's modal. Okay. So that would take me to a further aspect of that. We have our modal capacities as a certain type of living agent, in the world. And the world out there is not passive and inert. Gibson, in his ecological, this was for me in the early 90s when I first read Gibson, it was a revelation. Unlike the Saussure-Yamsler view in the structural semiotics idea that there's an amorphous, meaningless world out there on which language imposes its grid, its set of categories. No, the world out there is meaningful. Gibson's point was it's full of meaning and value, not linguistic meaning and value. And what I think we do is, through languaging and other forms of action, we're always trying to act on the meanings and values of the world and reconfigure them in different ways. So when I say, give me the cup of water, this bottle has meaning, or meaning potential, not linguistically speaking, but has its own meaning potential because it affords certain possibilities. I can take it in my hand, I can then drink from it, and so on. And in doing that, in say drinking the water, I am realizing a certain set of values, like satisfying thirst, etc., etc. Enjoying a nice quality still water, etc.
Thank you. I think you mentioned meaning, right? So our question is about meaning. So what is meaning in your languaging view?
Okay, I'll start off with a little negative observation. Meaning is not something that is just fixed in a form, as the code view tends to suggest. Okay, so it's like packaged up there in the form, ready-made for transmission. And for some decades now, people have used terms like meaning making. What I want to say is, often the word meaning is used without very clear definition, and we need to be more careful about this. And often it's assumed that there's a form and then you combine it with a meaning, and so you have this dichotomous way of thinking that the two are separate to start with. It's a strange, when you think about it, just even for a moment, you think it's a bit weird, really, because how could these two things actually, as in that formulation, logically speaking, they can't really be separate. So that requires, as I suggested earlier when we talked about grammar, we need, in a languaging view of this, we need to rethink the role of grammar rather than the carrier of meaning. It sets up constraints and possibilities. So constraints and enablements. And so meaning is something though that's emergent in the flow of languaging. And always So it's not something contained in a form or carried by a form or combined with a form. Rather, the forms are part of the constraints operating in the flow, like I've suggested earlier. Okay, and the meaning is something that emerges because, after all, when I say the bottle in that other, example we worked through a few moments earlier, I'm activating something. I'm activating a relationship with this bottle here in the world for a particular purpose. So the meaning is something that emerges through the synergy of all those factors. Yeah. Okay, directing your attention to it, then the anticipated outcome, getting a glass of water to quench my thirst, etc. Okay, all those things are so it's necessarily processual and emergent rather than something that's fixed in a form. The forms are part of the activation processes involved. Okay, which are, of course, conventional resources that have evolved in the culture or a particular culture for that kind of purpose. But they don't have fixed meanings. I mean, Halliday's quite right. He talks about meaning potential. Okay, but I would want to say that there's meaning potential in the world, but of course it's not linguistic meaning. Okay, it's, however, a meaningful world that we live in. We don't live in a meaningless world. We live in a world of meaning and value. Okay, that's a central insight in Gibson's work that I've taken on board as part of mine. So meaning will often not very well define. I mean, there are many people, and you could say a lot more about it, but it's how we constrain, locally speaking, for example, in a particular situation, how the constraints constrain the possibilities in a way which enables us to do things. Okay, and I think that's what meaning is all about. So you go from a potential where you never eliminate the potential altogether. I mean, the integrationists talk about, they talk a lot about indeterminacy. And I think what we do is we constrain the indeterminacy to the degree necessary to manage the situation. And if you don't understand me, you can say to me, well, sorry, I didn't understand. Can you say that again? Yeah. We can meta-language then. We've got this ability to go up to another level and meta-language to sort that out. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we don't work it out, it just fails. We get, but usually, and it's interesting, usually we manage. And we do so, we don't have to go on or think about infinite regressors that go on to eternity. We tame the regress to the degree necessary for local purposes. Okay, and and because we have different life histories, different experiences, different knowledge of the world, there's never going to be complete overlap. There'll be commonalities and there'll be lots of differences. Your understanding of something is never going to be the same as mine. And nor should it be. But we manage that indeterminacy we seek to the degree that we require. And if we don't work it out, we'll just say, well, sorry, well, can you say that again? Or let's try another way of doing this. And so, okay, so, because after all, languaging, we humans are, and we're not alone in among the other living beings on the planet, flexible, adaptive forms of intelligence, and the languaging that we have evolved is part of that. Is part of the application of our flexible, adaptive intelligence in the world. But I know great apes have it too, and we are now. I'll just make a quick comment on this. Work I'm involved in with colleagues in the United States on bonobos. Our nearest living along with chimpanzee, our nearest relatives. Okay, as anthropologists and primatologists like Sue Savage-Rumbaugh demonstrated, in a bicultural human pan world, they develop languaging abilities, And fascinatingly, recent research published in highly prestigious journals like Nature and Science is now showing that in the wild, apes have some form of language. Okay, yeah. And I know a friend of mine, Israeli primatologist, lived with a family of chimps in Mali, in the Sahel part of Western Africa, and they told him how he was expected to behave, the moral code, if you like, and so on. So that they had a form of language,
Wow.
and different families in the area had different dialects.
Wow.
And we know whales and that too have the different dialectal, so to speak, variation. So what I'm trying to say there, I'm not trying to I don't want to exaggerate this, but what I'm saying is absolutely true, is that there's a continuum between us. Whereas we've often thought as human beings that language is what makes us different from everything else on the planet, but we have to rethink that, okay? Because I was reading an article at the weekend about bird song and its relationships to human language and so on. That was really fascinating. So and so we have to think of these commonalities between us, I mean, and other living beings. So meaning, to go back to the question, is a very multifaceted and vast problem, okay, which has been exercising minds here in the Chinese world and in the Indian and the other great, and the West, of course. I mention those there because they are conspicuous for having developed philosophies and theories of language over very long periods of time. Okay, where meaning is obviously a central issue. Okay, and yet we still beleaguered, if you like, by theories in the West that tell us that it's something fixed in a code and so on. Okay, there's a problem there too, in the sense that we often tend to model ourselves on our own technologies, okay, whereas the technologies are extensions of aspects of ourselves, okay. They always, like the computer, or in the case of Saussure, he was clearly influenced by the then dominant communication technologies of telephony and telegraphy, things traveling down a wire, okay, and you see that in the speech circuit diagram. Two fixed talking heads, no world there, they're not doing anything, they're immobile, okay, and this sort of circuit joins them from one person's head to the other person's head. But that's not how languaging works in the human world.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would just want to emphasize then that it's a dynamic, open system in many respects, and it's multi-scalar because it operates over and integrates a variety or a diversity of timescales that enable us to, basically, so you could say from neuronal activity to pick one timescale right through to cultural history and so on, and many intermediate ones in between, basically, and it brings all those together.
Yeah. So that's the end of the interview, and we've learned a lot. That's a very profound paradigm shifting. So thank you so much, Professor Thibault.
Well, let me just say thank you to you. I've enjoyed the interview and the opportunity to exchange some thinking on, and you might even here I lapse a little bit into the code view, but that's how infused it is in our common sense ways of thinking. But I'd also just like to close by saying how amazed I am at being here at the Education University of Hong Kong with Angel and her fantastic team, and I'm really enjoying this wonderful work we're doing together. So it's been a great experience, and will continue to be. So again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Thank you.